Hi, everyone. I think we're going to get started. Just to start off, if you have a cell phone on you, if you could please turn it off, we would really appreciate it. Thank you. As I hope you are all aware, this is one of our keynote talks. The title of the talk is The Human Right to Food, and we have two wonderful, amazing speakers with us today. The first person who will be talking today is Molly Anderson. She is currently at the College of the Atlantic as the Partridge Chair in Food and Sustainable Agriculture Systems. She teaches about hunger, food security, and food sovereignty, system dynamics, food power, and, notably, food justice. She anticipates moving to Middlebury College in Vermont this summer, where she will be starting a food studies program. She is especially interested in how communities can achieve the right to food and nutrition, sustainability metrics, and how industrialized countries will move to a post-petroleum food system. She is part of the International Panel of Experts on Sustainable Food Systems, organized by Olivier de Schutter, the former UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food. To note, Mr. de Schutter also prepared a film for the conference, which we'll be showing tomorrow as part of the keynote talk, and we'll hopefully be putting it up online for all of you. We are also joined by Frances Moore Lappe. She is the author and co-author of 18 books, including the 3 million copy Diet for a Small Planet. She was named by Gourmet magazine as one of the 25 people whose work has changed the way America eats. Her most recent work, EcoMind, Changing the Way We Think to Create the World We Want, won a silver medal from the Independent Publisher Book Awards. She is the co-founder of 3 organizations, including Oakland-based think tank Food First and the Small Planet Institute, which she leads with her daughter, Anna. Frances and her daughter have also co-founded the Small Planet Fund, which channels resources to democratic social movements worldwide. So please join me in welcoming both of our speakers, and we'll get started with Molly Anderson.
Thank you, and good afternoon to all of you. It's a real honor to co-present with Frankie. I see her as one of the pioneers of food justice. She brought our attention a long time ago to ways that policies and eating patterns in this country are affecting the prospects for justice of people in poor countries and what we can learn from people in other countries. So I'm delighted to be here. I want to start with a few observations about why food justice seems to be rising to the fore right now, why it's on so many people's minds. I think first is the growing awareness of racism and racial inequity in this country. Ferguson certainly was a flashpoint for that. But with Ferguson came the realization for many of us that Black youth were being massacred by state forces with virtual impunity. This had been going on for a long time, continuing an ugly legacy of lynching in this country. I think that food justice also is benefiting from the attention to global inequity in access to resources. At this point, 80 people have the same wealth as the bottom 3.5 billion in the world. Oxfam, in its many incarnations around the world, has been raising awareness about the problems of global inequity and doing a very good job. I think that the attention to food justice also reflects the maturation of efforts in this country to address multiple problems with food systems. And to a small extent, it's related to a global upsurge in demands for food sovereignty. I'll be coming back to food sovereignty at the end of my talk, but first I want to go back a little bit to talk about what I mean by maturation of the conversation. How has the conversation about food justice changed over the last few decades? When I worked here in the Boston area, local food was exploding onto the national scene, and many people saw localism and direct marketing, that's farmers markets, CSAs. They really saw it as a pathway to justice, because finally farmers would stand a better chance of getting better economic returns, and customers would be reconnected with farmers. The conversation moved on to healthy food as people realized that local food isn't particularly accessible to many low-income customers due to its cost and its availability. The interest in local food was based on a desire to improve the well-being of low-income customers, and I think it is quite well-intentioned, but sometimes goes astray from what those low-income customers really want and need. It's a kind of colorblind policy. Hardly anybody in the United States is eating enough fresh fruits and vegetables, so better accessibility to healthy food, the argument goes, is going to help everyone. Then people said, wait a minute, it's not just healthy food, it's fair food, affordable food, green food, humane food, food raised with humane practices. And we saw the conversation moving on to real food and good food. And I think there will be a presentation that, I'm not sure if Aneem is here yet, but talking about real food tomorrow. Then we started paying more systematic attention to the barriers and the underlying causes of food system problems. And these are some of the reports that were coming out in this time period over the last decade. We were looking at the root causes, not just the symptoms, like lack of access to healthy food. And this shifted the conversation into issues of food power, the concentration of wealth and power in the food system nationally, and why corporations have increasing control over what we eat, as well as how they have greater control over, and if I can get, let me try to escape from that, more control over the international food system as well. And we're seeing this playing out in free trade agreements now. With strands from food sovereignty, the discussion now, I think, is moving into issues of food governance, food democracy, and who decides what people eat. This is a recent publication from the good people at the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy on deepening food democracy. So going back to my title, how is food justice connected with the right to food? And what does food justice really require of us, all of us sitting here? As I see it, food justice requires, first of all, attention to the history of structural violence and oppression in our country. These are the words of Policy Link. Slavery of Africans and Native Americans, the theft of land and water from Native Americans, a long and sordid history of racial discrimination that continues to play out in substandard wages and working conditions for people of color. That's the reality of our food system now. Current food systems have been shaped by historical practices and policies that systemically oppressed communities of color. Doing food justice also requires greater transparency about economic and social consequences of food system practices. Who's getting richer from these practices? Who's getting poorer? This goes back to those 80 people who will fit on one bus. And the 80 people include people who are making their money from food inputs and the sale of food. It also requires accountability to those who have not been well served by our food system. This accountability is demonstrated by, first, constant reflection and learning about the root causes of food injustice. Second, internal work by white people to understand the many ways in which we may be benefiting from oppression and pain, and continuing to ignore those who are not well served in the food system. Third, it requires active work to ensure the right to food for everyone, especially those who are vulnerable and politically marginalized. Fourth, it means making opportunities for meaningful voice and engagement by those who haven't been heard, who have borne the most costs of the food system and haven't received full benefits. And finally, it requires partnerships of mutuality and solidarity with low-income communities and communities of color. I'm not talking about charitable services or providing what we think they want. I'm talking about engagement to truly learn from impoverished communities and communities of color and to support them. In 2008, I tried to envision an alternative to market-based solutions, which seemed to be sucking all the air out of the room at that time, and talk about food system alternatives, and to some extent continue to do so. These market-based solutions included direct marketing, but also eco-labels, fair trade, and new ways to give consumers even more choice so that they could, quote unquote, vote with their forks. It seemed obvious to me that the market was never going to deliver justice, as obvious as that local foods weren't necessarily environmentally beneficial or fair. So I wrote a paper on rights-based food systems. The basic idea of rights-based food systems is that our current food system violates human rights on every front: farmers, workers, citizens, hungry people. And food system reform means a transformation to the conditions under which all human rights are respected, protected, and fulfilled. Those of you who study human rights will recognize this language. Of course, the rights of animals and the rights of nature are already being violated, but there isn't as clear an agreement about what these rights are. Human rights, in contrast, are agreed upon international goals ever since 1948 and the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, which our First Lady at the time, Eleanor Roosevelt, was instrumental in helping to craft. Human rights are justiciable. For example, cases have been brought to national courts to protect the right to food successfully. Human rights are indivisible and inalienable. Because of this, it seemed to me that rights-based food systems might have the potential to be a unifying goal across different food movements, to bridge groups that were fighting each other, that were working in isolation for their own independent goals, often fighting with each other for funding and for legislative attention. I wanted them to be working together better. But rights-based food systems didn't get much traction in 2008. I have to say, Heifer International briefly considered revising their food program around this concept, but otherwise it didn't even seem to ripple the water, which got me thinking about why not? The first thing that I went to is the lack of comprehension in the United States of economic, social, and cultural rights. The United States is horribly isolated from other countries in its failure to ratify the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights and the 8 other major human rights treaties and conventions. This goes back to 1966 and the Cold War, when 2 covenants on human rights were developed, and the United States took the position that economic, social, and cultural rights are best met by the market. The United States wanted to distinguish itself from the socialist countries over there. We endorse civil and political rights, but not economic, social, and cultural rights, which reflected, I think, a fundamental misunderstanding of the inseparability of human rights. You can't just cherry pick human rights. We've retained this perspective despite abundant evidence that the market does not work in this way to provide these kinds of rights. It has to be directed by and reined in by public policies. And unlike most other countries in the world, we lack basic public policies to ensure economic, social, and cultural rights. For those of you in the back, this map is showing the countries that have endorsed this covenant and the countries that haven't. And you'll see that the United States, bright blue, is the only industrialized country that has failed to ratify the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. In terms of food, the United States still uses a charitable approach to address food insecurity. Primarily federal assistance programs, which are a wonderful stopgap, but these are doled out at the whim of Congress, and Congress is pretty mean-spirited right now. NGOs have pioneered programs to increase access to food that range from bounty bucks in Boston or other voucher systems that low-income people can use in farmers markets to get fresh food, to better school food options, to gleaning, and healthy food prescriptions that are underwritten by health insurance plans. Recently, there seems to be a lot of interest in redirecting food that would otherwise be wasted onto the plates of low-income people. These are decent programs. They are all well-intentioned, but this is not a rights-based approach. Poor people need and want exactly the same food that rich people want. They really don't want our food waste. Poor children in particular, they need guaranteed access to healthy food in order to grow into healthy adults. Yet according to the latest USDA data that's available, this is 2013, 1 in 5 children in the United States lives in a food insecure household that does not have guaranteed access to healthy food at all times. In half of these households, children as well as adults are food insecure. They're going without the food they need. While local programs can definitely improve access to healthy food for limited populations, they will never result in the elimination of hunger and food insecurity. Other countries that have recognized the right to food at the national scale and are using rights-based approaches to improve their food systems have shown dramatic results, dramatic increases in food security, even when the country is far less wealthy than the United States. In the United States, household food insecurity rates have remained static or actually increased since reliable measures were first implemented in the mid-1990s. Unlike less wealthy countries, Brazil, a great example, which Frankie will be coming back to, with its Fome Zero program, the United States does not have federal programs to eliminate hunger and food insecurity, but only to dampen the most corrosive effects. This is not right. This probably occurred to you folks already, but the other obvious reason why the idea of rights-based food systems never took off was because it didn't have the support of people on the ground. It was just my idea, expressed in an academic paper in a journal. And social change doesn't happen that way. It doesn't happen because some academic comes up with an idea. It happens because a group of people find common cause. And that's where I want to focus for the rest of my talk. The place I see this happening most vividly today is at the global level, in the Committee on World Food Security. Since 2009, the Committee on World Food Security has become the premier international forum for discussion of issues of food security. The CFS was reformed in 2009 so that the people who are on the front lines of hunger, the people who are working with civil society through social movements made up of small-scale workers, fishers, farmers, women, indigenous people, the urban poor, youth, landless people, they are all working together and speaking on food system issues in this global forum. They have full participation in every activity up to voting, which is reserved for member countries of the Committee on World Food Security. This is appropriate because it's the national governments that are responsible for implementing policies to protect hungry people. All of the decisions and recommendations of the Committee on World Food Security must be congruent with the right to food. This was part of the reform. The decisions must consider the best evidence, which is assembled through a high-level panel of experts with equitable gender and regional representation, and with people from civil society organizations. Every year, participation in the Committee on World Food Security has grown. In October 2014, this was the breakdown. Nearly 800 representatives of Committee on World Food Security stakeholder groups, that's governments, civil society, the private sector, international and regional organizations, nearly 800 people showed up for this big week-long meeting in Rome. It included 223, on the chart here, 223 individuals from 127 different civil society organizations and academic institutions. I was there, I brought 8 students along, and they had a wonderful time. The civil society mechanism, which is the organizing body for civil society, had 151 individuals from 81 organizations. The private sector had 91 individuals from 71 organizations. Again, their representation is growing every year. And you're probably wondering, well, what did they talk about for a whole week? Some of the things they talked about, you can find this report online on the FAO website, but some of the things they talked about were progress that's been made on the right to food in the 10 years since international voluntary guidelines were created in 2004. They talked about monitoring for accountability of the Committee on World Food Security. They talked about the critical importance of small-scale farmers to feed the world, and they're the people who are feeding the world now. They talked about the kinds of investment that are needed in agriculture and how that investment should be regulated. They talked about the role of fisheries and aquaculture in achieving food security and what can be done about food waste. Most fundamentally, the Committee on World Food Security, beyond these separate topics that are discussed, it allows conflicts in worldview and conflicts in how people interpret the evidence that's before us. Scientific evidence is not all that cut and dried, really, but it allows those conflicts to be aired and to be discussed with the people who are actually suffering from hunger, able to say, here's how we see it, and here's how we are impacted by these policies that you people are implementing. Food sovereignty is one of the banners under which civil society organizations organize at the Committee on World Food Security and around the world. Food sovereignty is an international movement. It was started by small-scale farmers, but increasingly it's being adopted by other groups. Its advocates include millions of small-scale farmers and fishers, joined by proponents of agroecology, women's rights, and indigenous peoples. Right to food, again, the first principle of food sovereignty. Detailing what food sovereignty means in practice is rich and exciting. There were two fantastic conferences over the last calendar year, one at Yale, and one at the Institute for Social Studies in the Netherlands. I think this was the poster they used at ISS, that brought together practitioners, activists, academicians. And there was also a very recent conference on agroecology in Mali that came out with a declaration on agroecology as the preferred practice, agricultural practice, for these small-scale farmers who are feeding the world. While many of the details are still being hammered out, food sovereignty provides a vision of the kind of food system that people want, a vision that's in harmony with nature and that's in harmony where people are in harmony with each other. This visioning work is beginning in the United States too, and may eventually result in an enlightened food policy, such as the one that's been developed by our neighbors in the north in Canada. This is resetting the table, and there's several other examples of people's food policies that have been developed. A really wonderful contrast. I'd love to see a people's food policy laid out against the Farm Bill. I think it would look extremely different than the Farm Bill. So before turning the floor over to Frankie, I want to leave you with just a few thoughts. First, the United States has much to learn from other countries in their approaches to food justice. In particular, the United States would benefit from studying how other countries have implemented the right to food. It's no mystery. The steps have been laid out clearly in many, many documents, including these guidelines, voluntary guidelines on implementing the right to food, established in 2004. It's simply a matter of political will and national priorities. As we work on food justice, we need a clear vision of the kind of food system and society that we want. This vision can draw from the concept of food sovereignty as it's unfurling in many places, but our vision will be unique. It will be distinct for us. The vision and the action to make that vision real must be shared across different races, kinds of people, and interest groups. We simply can't afford to be split into factions and to fight against each other. The struggle for healthy food is joined at the hip with struggles for debt-free, open access higher education, for affordable housing, for climate change, mitigation and adaptation, for health, for living wages, for public transportation, for women's rights, for voters' rights, for campaign finance reform. All of these movements are inseparable. What this means practically is that you need to find people who share your values, your passions, your heart, and figure out what you can do together to make a difference. Start working, even if you don't have all the answers. Evaluate who's benefiting from your work and who's suffering, and keep trying to make spaces for people who are being left out of your vision. Keep working until you, too, can see real progress toward food democracy and the right to food. I want to thank all of you for the work that you are doing and for being here for this conference. And I'd like to turn things over to Frankie.
So just the organizers know, I had planned to use that music stand so I could be among you, and then I realized I could be among you, but I couldn't see your faces, and you probably couldn't see mine. So here I am at the podium. So does that mean that I can take this, should I take this out of my pocket and leave it on? Can I, if I turned it on, then I could move around a little bit more? Okay, and turn this off? Not yet. Okay, is this working? Is it working? No. Not yet. Louder. Is it working? No. No? Is it, should I keep testing it? Should I save you these minutes of stall? I thought I turned it on.
It is on. I think it might just be a little too far down.
Farmers are one group that can never hear.
Okay, does it work? Does it work? All right, thank you for your patience with me. And Molly, where are you? Where are you? Thank you so much. Thank you for your unending leadership and courage, and I'm so delighted to share the podium with you. So, I want to share with you in three parts this afternoon. First, I want to recognize that in humanity's path to making food a protected right, which arguably I think should be the most basic of all, since we can't enjoy any other human right without it, I want to start us with square one, asking just what is this problem, what is the extent of this problem that we are hoping to solve through a rights-based approach? And then I'd like to take you with me to a delightful moment in my life when I actually got to see and taste food as a human right in Brazil. And finally, very briefly, I want to share with you personally what the lessons I'm learning, how they have changed me. So, am I good? You're having trouble hearing me? Okay, so should I give up on this? Okay, I will give up on this. And I will go with the program. Okay. Thank you. Okay, all you on C-SPAN watching this, I hope you forgive me. Okay, okay. So let me get started then. We want to end hunger, right? So how do we define it to know whether or not we're ending it? And Molly and I were part of what I think of as a very wonderfully compatible international cabal starting in 2012. Of civil society people who found ourselves incredibly disturbed by the realization that humanity still lacks a meaningful measure of hunger. And here's what happened. We saw that there were messages then coming through the media from the Food and Agriculture Organization's main hunger measure that were generally so positive. Basically, we were hearing that we're well on our way to meeting the Millennial Development Goals, and if we just do a little uptick with economic growth, that we will be there. And we learned that by 2014, that developing countries had cut the share of their hungry people by 42% in the developing countries compared to 1990. It sounds like amazing progress. Amazing progress. And yes, true, still 800 million people hungry, but amazing progress. But we felt like something was really off, and so we dug deeper. And we realized if measuring progress by the number of hungry people rather than the percentage of the population, which I personally feel is a much more real measure. After all, you tell a hungry person, oh, you're a smaller share of the total, it's not going to make them happy. It's not going to make them less hungry. So we looked at it from the percentage-wise, from the number, and we realized that if we took progress measured by the number of hungry people rather than percentage, the drop since 1990 is not 42%, but about half of that, about 21%. And then we asked, is it really widely spread over the world? And we said, well, actually, if you take out China from that picture, if you remove China, mostly progress in the 1990s, that the actual gain and drop in number of hungry people in the developing world since 1990 is about 7%. Yes, it is progress, but not nearly what the world receives in this single measure of calorie deficiency. So this is what we realized, that if we looked at the FAO measure, and this is what we really honed in on, how the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN defines hunger, we realized that it is now what even the FAO says is very strict. You have to be below a very low minimum for more than a year. Now think of what that means. Think of what that means. For one, you can be below that minimum for only the entire lean season between harvests, and you're not counted as hungry. You can be pregnant and go through your entire pregnancy below that minimum level, and you still would not be captured in that measure of hunger. So it seemed entirely that, in fact, way too strict, because we know that even short-term hunger can have devastating effects on a developing fetus, on anyone compromised by disease, and on children. And so we realized, too, that there is another big reason why the standard measure that is used by the Food and Agriculture Organization is limited. It is strictly about calories. And as we know, and Molly strongly alluded to, we know that calories and nutrition are disconnecting in the world today. I recommend a new study in Lancet that looked at this globally and said that worldwide, that poor nutritional foods are outpacing any improvements in most regions of the world. And so what is happening then is that calories and nutrition are very separate things, that one can be eating more than enough calories and not have the nutrition that we need. And of course, that's true in the United States, where something like 40% of the calories that our children eat are nutritionally empty. But now let's look at the implications for a country like India. Now, officially, with the calorie measure of hunger, 1 in 7 of Indians is hungry. But if you look at nutrition, think for a minute that it's almost unbelievable. 4 in 5 children under the age of 2 are anemic. Half of all Indian women with incredible implications in childbearing are anemic. So this all sounded like numbers to me until I talked to a doctor in rural India who said he observed a big change in the last few decades. He said, now I treat about 2,000 patients a month, very poor farmers. He said the amazing thing is most of them have enough calories, but 60% of them are either diabetic or are suffering heart conditions, 60% of them. And so what I'm suggesting is that the world desperately needs a more accurate, more useful, more meaningful approximation of the extent of the crisis. Now, I want to hats off to the FAO for continuing to expand its supplements to this calorie measure that is mostly what people hear. They've included, you can find on the FAO website, the suite of food security indicators, and you can also find news about what's called the Voices of the Hungry, which is an interview-based, actual my experience of hunger way of looking at the problem. But nonetheless, there is only one measure, that calorie count measure that comes up with 800 million, that the public hears. So I'm taking a very radical stand with you this afternoon. Because the world lacks a meaningful, comprehensive measure, I'm arguing for a stand-in that we can grab right now that gets us a lot closer to the actual extent of the crisis of nutrition. And is there one? I'm arguing that there is one already, and it is stunting. Today, 1 in 4 of the world's children are stunted. Now, stunting is caused by too little food, both the mother and the child, poor quality food for both, and it's also caused by unsanitary water, because if you have bacteria, they can interfere with your body's capacity to absorb the nutrients, so that even if you eat nutritious food, you can't get the nutrients. So now, of course, if we think of stunting as just a childhood condition, it seems pretty wild to say that this should be the stand-in for the extent of hunger in the world, for all of us. But in truth, stunting affects people for a lifetime, typically. It's a condition that it leads to a weakened immune system, to cognitive impairment, and for females, severe reproductive problems. So because it has afflicted generations, and because the conditions bring lifelong harm, I'm arguing that any person designated as a child as stunting should be counted throughout their lives as among those suffering the effects of stunting, what I call nutritional deprivation. That's part of what, under this heading of what I call nutritional deprivation. In other words, if you look at it this way, then 1/4 of the world's people are suffering from nutritional deprivation. 1.8 billion people. Now, of course, stunting as a proxy for the extent of nutritional deprivation is still incomplete, because to those harmed by stunting, we are those nutritionally deprived who are among the 2 billion of us who lack at least one essential nutrient. And so the term, for example, vitamin A deficiency means blindness for about 250,000 children every year, and vitamin iron deficiency is linked to 1 in 5 maternal deaths. And all those are definitely not captured in this, but it's still closer than what we have now. So I'm saying that the term nutritional deprivation, the concept of nutritional deprivation, seems useful particularly also because it captures at least a good portion of both calorie and nutrient deficiency, and that it also suggests that the problem is not just being deficient as a passive state of deficiency, but one is being actively deprived by power inequities throughout the world. So that's where my journey has taken me on this, trying to get my head around what is the extent of the problem. And I'd love it if you disagreed with me and you wanted to argue with me and show me another way. That would be great. But it leaves me believing that the extent of the problem is about at least twice as big as the official number that we hear as the official count of hungry people in the world. So I'm saying the world definitely, desperately needs a better tool. So now I'm going to move to the second stanza of my song today. And I would like to take you to a place in the world that has really taken to heart everything that Molly's talking about, the idea, the reality of making food. And the key to it in Brazil with Zero Hunger Campaign, the language, the framing of it is always stated as the goal being food and nutritional security, recognizing this disconnect that is growing throughout the world. So, as many of you know, in 2010, Brazil added the right to adequate food as in its constitutions, as have about 24 countries. And this was a result, beginning in the 1980s, of social activism that created during that period an estimated 7,000 committees working on everything from income generation to urban gardens to support for agrarian reform. And it was a social mobilization which observers say was the essential trigger to the policy commitments that made the right to food begin for real when President Lula was elected in 2003 and announced his Zero Hunger campaign. He pledged that by the end of his term that everyone in Brazil would have 3 meals a day. He didn't quite meet that, but I want to tell you some amazing things that I got to see. One Brazilian city, 2 to 3 million people, Belo Horizonte, symbolizes everything that the rights-based approach, or I shouldn't say everything, but a lot of what the rights-based approach that Molly was talking to us about really means. And so before I go into the good news, I want to acknowledge that in the news today, if you're following it, there's big opposition to what I'm now going to describe by those who are privileged and feel very threatened. But please, as you hear this news, do not despair. Remember what William Hastie, the first black jurist in the United States, told us: democracy is becoming, it is not being, it is easily lost, it is never finally won, its essence is eternal struggle. So I want to tell you what I saw firsthand that so changed my life. My daughter and I traveled to Belo Horizonte and for our book, to write our book, Hope's Edge, my daughter Anna and I. And what I'm going to describe could happen in any city, really. For example, it happened because a mayor in 93, Partridge ran on the platform as food as a right. And he was elected. And his officials said basically to the citizens, look, if you are too poor to buy enough food in the market, you're still a citizen. I'm still accountable to you. I'm going to make the market work for you. And what he did was to put together a city agency that was then advised by a civil society council that represented everybody from farmers to universities to business and religious leaders and labor, and they came up with literally dozens of initiatives. So, for example, you can walk outside the bus stop in downtown Belo Horizonte, and like many spots throughout the city, you will see something called Direct from the Countryside, where the city has made available a corner of the city land for free to a farmer if they will come in and sell their great produce in the inner city at prices that poor people can afford. So with no middle person to take the big cut, the farmers are delighted. And as they told us, beaming, that they had many more customers, and so they were making a much higher profit even though they were selling their food at a much lower price. That was called Direct from the Countryside. On a larger scale, they have something called ABC markets, which in Portuguese is translated, it's food for less, basically. And there are now in Belo 3 dozen of these. Here's the deal. The city says to the grocer, you can have this spot for your grocery store at a reduced price if you will keep 20 items that are essential items for health at a lower than market price that people in your neighborhood can afford. Then you can charge the market price for anything else. And of course, the grocers loved it, and they lined up to sign up for these programs. Now there are 36 of them. And then there are what are called people's restaurants, and it's the farthest thing you could imagine from a soup kitchen. Anna and I had lunch in one. It's like a room, it was bigger than this, open air, beautiful airy space, fantastic smell of delicious healthy food, and people from all walks of life sitting at big tables together, just chatting. And the deal is that this is government subsidized, but it's not a giveaway. It's 50 cents a meal, government subsidized. Everybody's welcome. There is no means test. And so, for example, the lady at our table had 3 kids and obviously needed that extra boost of healthy food with her children, and they loved it. That was cool. And then we met a soldier who wanted to get married, but he couldn't afford an apartment. So he was there just to save some money. And then we talked to an elder gentleman who took the bus there every day because he wanted the companionship. And one of the touches that I really liked about it is, as we left, there's a big area where people are standing around chatting, and on the walls were pinned the day's newspaper. So if you couldn't afford a newspaper, you could still know what's going on in your community. But the beauty of it is that there was no stigma. It was where you wanted to be. It was kind of a happening place. And now there was one when we were there. Now I believe there are 3. Finally, another initiative, there were many more than these, but one that struck us was this idea that the government can help keep the market honest. And so the government teamed up, the city government teamed up with the university to track the prices for these 20 basic commodities and where you could go, what stores had the lowest cost for those particular commodities. And they post the results of this survey at bus stops, and they would announce it over the radio. And so you know how it is in our country that the poor communities often have the highest prices, but this was a way to help push against that kind of price gouging. So these and many, many more initiatives, what do they produce? Let me just tell you a couple of things. That these kinds of initiatives, along with a federal program, which is an income transfer program to the poorest in Brazil, in the city of Belo Horizonte, in 12 years, cut the child death rate by 72%. That's got to be like a historic rate of social change. 72%. And how much did it cost? Well, it cost about 2% of the city budget. I calculated it, don't quote me, I think, but got to double check this, but it's about a penny a day per resident of the city. So this courageous innovation has actually, I believe courage is definitely contagious, and so people have been visiting, and most recently delegates from Namibia, from African mayors coming to Belo to see how they can learn and take lessons home to Africa. So what are the lessons that we need to take to heart? And I want to take you to the final conversation that my daughter and I had with Adriana Aranja, who, when we visited Belo Horizonte, she was the coordinator of these many programs, and from a student, she had been passionate about food justice. And what did she say to us that will never, ever leave me? The lessons. She said, behind all of these changes that you've seen, Francis and Anna, she said, all of them, she said, there's a new social mentality. That mentality is that good food for all of us is just like education or like healthcare. It's a public good. It was a shift in consciousness. She said, secondly, that people, because we in government are behaving the way we are, this idea that the government is some incompetent interferer is diminishing. And people are realizing that the state doesn't have to provide everything. It can actually be a convener, setting the rules and convening and allowing citizens to, enabling citizens to come up with their own solutions. And so I was thrilled, but she then just kept going and going and going in Portuguese, and I don't speak a word of it. And I was trying to be patient until one point when her when her eyes teared up. And she just kept going, and I couldn't help myself then. Again, I nudged the interpreter and said, Leo, what made Adriana tear up? And he stopped her and she said, I knew how much hunger there was in the world, but what I didn't know, and what upsets me so, is how easy it is to end it. And you can imagine, because I still am tearing up, that I have been thinking about those words ever since, and trying to figure out what she really meant. And I feel like I know. I want to go back and talk to her and see if I'm right. But I realized that she wasn't saying her job was easy. She wasn't saying these things had happened overnight, because they hadn't. But what she was saying is that ending hunger is doable. It's possible. It's possible if we create communities where the city feels accountable to all of the citizens, and the citizens feel accountable, doubly accountable, to themselves to come up with solutions and to holding the officials accountable as well. And so what is that called? I call that democracy. And I also realize that we don't have one. We don't have one. I call it we have privately held government, which should be an oxymoron, but unfortunately isn't. In an international ranking, project carried out, led by a professor at the Kennedy School, international ranking of electoral integrity, the US ranks 35th behind Mexico. So, the key lesson from Brazil's and Belo Horizonte's story for me is about democracy. What is democracy and how do we make it? So as I hinted at earlier, that what made real the right to food emerged from the 1980s and onward, in which the food movement joined forces with labor, with religious leaders, with landless, and with others, joined forward to create a powerful political movement, one strong enough that then elected President Lula, who created the Zero Hunger Campaign. This is what made Belo possible. So the lesson for me today is this: to succeed in ending the outrage of nutritional deprivation in a world of food abundance, we too must and we can build a broad political movement, what I love to call living democracy. Democracy is not something we have, but something we do. This is where my heart is heading me. This is where I'm headed personally. And if you want to integrate the commitments that you already have into this broader canopy of hope, I ask you, I'll let you know that I'd love to connect with you if you want to talk to me afterwards, or contact me via the Small Planet Institute website. I'd love to talk to you. So, I will close with the lines that we had on the first screen, which was a lesson that Anna and I brought back from our journey that took us to Belo Horizonte. And it's simply this: hope is not what we find in evidence, it's what we become in action together. Thank you so very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you both so much. So Frankie and Molly are going to take questions, and if you would like to ask them a question, we ask that you line up in the aisles. There's 2 microphones, and then they're just going to call on people and take questions as they come.
We coordinated our colors. We did not.
Very intentional. I think you were first.
I'm Brad Wilson, an Iowa farmer. I didn't hear a lot about the right to be paid fairly on the farm side. My understanding is that most of the hungry are farmers or others in a farming economy. You know, a right to a fair share. They talk about land reform. How about farm share reform, where we get paid fairly all over the world? And I just wondered if you'd comment on that. My look at the history of at the food movement today and at the history of the food movement is that it hasn't done much on the issue of what La Via Campesino calls for and what the WTO Africa group calls for, which is a price floor instead of writing a check, just like we have a minimum wage. I just wonder what you thought of all that.
Well, I would agree completely, Brad, and the right to decent compensation for your labor is one of the recognized human rights that farmers in this country certainly are not enjoying.
Just, you know, like, for example, a Place at the Table film called for cheaper vegetable prices. I heard that again today, without talking about, is that fair for farmers?
I think that there's a session on the tension between affordable food and good prices for farmers. I'm really looking forward to seeing that specific question explored in that session. But thanks for bringing that up, Brad. Yeah.
Hi, thank you, Molly and Frankie, both of you, for being here. I really appreciate your work, and you're focusing on one of the problems that's one of the most important and significant sources of suffering in the world today, so thank you for that. I have a question about the right to food that you both discussed. So I suppose it might be a little bit different than political or civil rights in the sense that the latter often require a government not to do something or not to interfere with something, whereas the right to food seems like it would require the government to do something. So I wonder what moral significance, if any, you attribute to that distinction.
I can start to answer that, and I'm sure that Frankie has something to add too. The right to food is a right to respect, protect, and fulfill. So first of all, simply respecting and protecting people's ability to grow their own food and to secure the food that they want in the ways that they want to get it. That's the beginning of it. The government is not obligated to feed people except under an emergency situation. That it's one of the misconceptions in this country that's very common about the right to food. It doesn't mean that everybody just lines up and gets a free handout from the government. It's that truly the government backs out and prevents all the ways that say corporations in this country are interfering with people's ability to eat the food that they want, raised in the ways that they want it to be raised.
Yeah, and I think that the Bello stories really capture that what you're saying is that the approach was not to create food giveaway. It was to enable people to actually access the market, and that's why I love that general framing from the beginning. If you're a citizen, if you're hungry, you're still a citizen, and you still need us, the government, to make sure the market serves you. And so the market then becomes simply a tool in which we set our values boundaries, is how I like to look at it. It's a tool in which we set the values boundaries around so that everyone can have access. And in fact, I think we should change the meaning of the word free market to mean freedom to access meet our basic needs in the market. That's the freedom that we need, and market driven by highest return to existing wealth can never do that. So I think this distinction is really important, and what I love so much about the Brazil example, it seems they really got that at a very cellular level in the way they designed their programs.
Thank you.
I think you're next.
Okay, great. I thank you. I commend you both on your work. The concept of democracy came up a lot in both of your talks. And I think that in a way of putting it in a certain lens where the democracy is, how do I put this? I'm sorry, but I feel like personally that saying that we don't live in a democracy undervalues and devalues all the movements that have happened up until this point in this country. And so your talks are a lot about inclusivity and about, working together. And so I feel like both of your talks, while they're wonderful and your work is wonderful, it's exclusive. And I just wanted to hear, because what about the government and what about the private sector? And why don't you feel like they can be a part of the conversation?
Frankie has thought so deeply about this for a long time. I really want to give her a chance to talk first.
I love your question, and I resonate with it, but the meaning of what I'm saying is I want to honor, I highly recommend a book by Harvey K., The Four Freedoms, where he takes us back through the great generations embodiment of the best of the democratic tradition in this country. And I want to honor that by saying that right now, When I say privately held government, I just mean that most Americans believe, 80% of us, Republicans, Democrats, it's very inclusive percentage, believe that corporations have too much power over our political public decision making, too much private power over public decisions. And that's what I'm trying to name, while definitely honoring, and I hope I do in all of my writing, you know, the incredible courage of people who have brought us so much progress, and that the backsliding is just so terribly frightful. And I want to compare us to other countries, as I did, to shock us into, we can do better. We know we can do better in this country, like that Mexico comparison, not to exclude or shame, but to call us to do better, because I want to be proud of my country.
I can hardly add to that, but that to me is exactly, it's the passion and the ways that people have put their lives on the line for so long that makes our corporatocracy in this country now so hideous to me, that we have backslid. And we don't have, ever since Citizens United, and really before that, we don't have a government that is truly by the people, for the people, of the people.
Just one PS on here, that this is not anti-corporate. It is anti-corporate control of the public sector, public decision-making, public power, that absolutely, I believe in market economies in which corporations play a role, but it's the public's role to make public decisions. That's the distinction.
Thank you.
And if folks wouldn't mind identifying who you are when you ask questions, you have an advantage over us. You're next.
I always hate to identify myself because I forget my name. My name's Louisa Kasdan, and I run an organization called Let's Talk About Food. So I have a question. You two have both been icons of mine for as long as I've known your names, which is, in Frankie's case, since I was in high school, I think. In our current situation in America, where being poor is kind of demonized at the central level, I'm very pessimistic when I look at the SNAP budgets cuts and when I look at the Farm Bill. How concretely do you maintain your optimism, and what can a group of incredible young energy like all of these people do to take specific steps to start moving from sort of a charity-based approach to food insecurity to a rights-based approach? Thank you.
I can tell you very quickly and simply how I keep my optimism. It's by working with young people. That's why I have to work in colleges and universities, because young people are our hope, and they still have that optimism and truly believe that change is possible. EcoMind, you have laid out so many different steps that people can be taking, but perhaps you'd like to give a few.
First, I want to make a distinction that helps me, is that I don't call myself an optimist, and I certainly am not a pessimist. I've decided that I'm an absolute dyed-in-the-wool possibilist. And what I mean, and this comes directly out of the work I did to write EcoMind, shifting to that perspective, that I realize the nature of life is change, connection, and co-creation, my 3 C's, and therefore, how hubristic, how incredibly prideful it would be to say, no, we can't do this. How crazy that would be, because so much as everything I just told you today about Brazil, for example, I would never have predicted when I was the age of the young people that I work with. I would have said, nah, that's not going to happen. Brazil's going to be the last country to ever change. It was so, the tight control was so extreme. So that's one approach, is just, I guess, very practically, every week, at least once a week, find a story of something that totally shocks you that you thought was never possible. And we try to specialize that at the Small Planet Institute. But to just remind you that it's not possible to know what's possible. And that the only choice we don't have is whether to change the world. Because everything you are doing, somebody is watching. Every purchase you make, it's rippling through the marketplace. Your choice of your profession and how you model in front of your peers and children someday, all those are changing the world. And so I try to keep that idea alive that, yes, the only choice we don't have is whether to change the world, and that we need, and this talk about, your organization is Let's Talk About? Food. Let's talk about food. And that's exactly the kind of thing that I believe that we gain courage in community. And there are studies showing this. If we have our friends with us, we actually in tests with psychologists that we judge literally the hill to be less steep. And so anything that you all are doing to create that kind of connection, you are building courage. People taking risks, having new ideas, and breaking free of the do for from the charity model into the rights of democracy model. So I think those are the key of it takes some work. It takes some work to find these examples and spread them. But I've often said now, telling a story of possibility is a revolutionary act.
Hi, I'm Christine, and I work with a food nonprofit called Chefs Collaborative. It's mostly with chefs who want to make America eat better, and the way that they define that. It's been a blast. But my lifelong kind of learning is food justice, and mostly how it intersects with economic justice. It's very deeply intertwined, as you know much better than I do. And I guess my question was, and I was kind of like ruminating over this when you were talking about Bello, how the city government was able to kind of create this robust local economy and local market when we have such a demanding and rampantly running global market, which has, in the past caused a lot of, famine, for example, if like in late 1800s in India when there was huge famine caused by El Nino, but it wasn't because there wasn't enough food, it was because these free markets caused all of the grain to bypass all the people living there to England instead. So like how this city, Bello, was able to kind of work and regulate this global market demand versus cultivating a local market demand, or were they just not connected to the local market? I'm not very familiar with that situation.
Well, I can't claim to know enough to answer your question well, but I bet a lot more research has been done on it. One name that you can look for is Cecilia Rocha, a Canadian scholar, R-O-C-H-A. She's written a lot about the Bello experience. And I bet your questions could be answered more fully, but my impression was that it wasn't so much, or I wasn't hearing about the regulation of corporate agribusiness as much as it was creating real alternatives that were helping the small farmer, and that's also true now at a national level. A third of the food that supplies schools has to be supplied by small local farmers. So it's that kind of thing to give a leg up to the small local producer, rather than maybe they're also doing some other kinds of rule setting regarding corporate power in Bello, but I don't know. They also they have school gardens and community gardens, and they do cooking classes and lessons, and all of that sort of thing as well. And they do food supplements. They take ground up eggshells, powder, very highly nutritious, and they lace flour for little kids in preschool with these, just really creative. That was a total waste product before, right? And they realized that there was something that they could do that would add no cost, So I'd love to know more, and if you keep in touch if you learn the answer to your question, because I wish I knew it.
I mean, so basically you're saying, it's not a second question, but basically you're saying that this city government had the power and the legitimacy to implement all these acts.
Because it brought together this council that with representatives from all sectors, including business, that came up with all of these ideas and helped to implement them. And so it had to be of benefit to a lot of people to work. And that was the beauty of it. And that's what Adriana was telling us, is that this spirit of that government doesn't have to do that government can enable citizens to come up with the solutions. And that was the spirit. And it had to do with trust. And the trust is that's so broken down in our at our government level, and how do we rebuild that trust? And part of it is removing the power of private wealth that makes us believe that we can't trust what's really happening in our bodies of governance.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Fernando. I'm a PhD student in geography. And my question is for Francis. I think you told us a lot about Brazil, and it's a beautiful story. But what you didn't say was that's basically because, well, it's highly related to the fact that the MST has a long tradition of reclaiming not only the land, but the food system in Brazil. And I think it's important to say, especially in the context of this country, because if I understood correctly, is that you were trying to give us an example of something that we can actually do in the US. But nevertheless, I think it's very complicated if you don't understand the role of the farmers or the landless movement in Brazil. And I think this is important, especially to the farmer that spoke at the beginning, because it is really about differentiating the type of farmers, for example, that we have in the US. I saw some stickers downstairs, like say, power to the farmers. But when I think about farmers in Brazil or in Mexico, where I come from, I think about campesinos, people that actually self-sustain, that produce food for themselves and for the communities and for the people. But when I think about farmers in the US, it's a different type of person. So I guess my question now is, what do you think about that difference, disparity, in a way, of the farmers in the US and the farmers in the South that can achieve this type of projects?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm delighted that you raised the MST, because that was part of what we looked at, and it has also just had a profound impact on my sense of possibility. And so I did throw in the landless as one of the key elements of the landless workers movement that led to a political movement strong enough to actually elect a leader that was going to begin the zero hunger programs. And so I just apologize for, I was worried about just having so much to say in so little time. But I totally agree that the landless workers movement is one of the most, it is probably the largest social movement in our entire hemisphere, and has settled something like a third of a million families on 20 million acres of land, an enormous achievement, and has inspired much, much more land redistribution than that, and has created a whole organic seed line, and has trained its farmers in agroecology methods. And so it definitely needed more of an attention in what I said today, because it is a central player in what became this right to food, a right to, I gotta get it right now, food and nutritional security in Brazil. So if any of you don't know about the landless workers movement, there's a Friends of the MST website that is very rich and very, very inspiring in terms of what they've been able to achieve, and against all sorts of odds, including the murder of over decades, the murder of 1,500 of their members because of the resistance by the landed elite in Brazil. So hats off to the MST. And we have much to learn from them, but I think I'll just let another person speak.
Hi, my name is Michelle. I'm a lawyer from Quebec, Canada, and I'm an LLM student at Notre Dame Law School. We're talking about the human right to food. You mentioned that human rights are justiciable, and you mentioned also the Resetting the Table program in Canada, but unfortunately, we still don't have in Canada, and I think in the US, no ways to bring suits or claims in front of tribunals for violation of the right to food. So I was wondering if you had some suggestions on ways to do that or work towards that. Thank you.
I don't personally, and I'm not a lawyer. I'm not sure how in the cases in which people have brought cases before tribunals, I'm not sure how they paved the way and how they created that framework. I know that the legal power exists at the international level, and I know that FION, that's probably the first place I would be going to look for examples or guidelines of how to make that happen. FION is the international organization that is promoting the right to food around the world. Great website, and they really keep you up to date on what's happening in terms of legal actions around the world. But I wish I could give you a better answer. Liz.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Henderson, an organic farmer. One of the simplest ways to make sure that people got good food would be to raise the minimum wage. And on April 15th, all of you can join in on the demonstrations and the strikes that are going to be happening all over the country by fast food workers. I'm sure there are people who are going to be doing it here in Boston. So having huge numbers of you here participating in support for low-wage workers who are pushing for a minimum wage of $15 an hour, which would be a very nice wage, too, for the farmers who grow the food that you eat. I never made that much as a farmer. So we need to have a movement of all of the workers together, farmers, farm workers, and other food workers. And from the farm worker panel that we had this morning comes a request to you and for this conference for next year that you have more workers speaking at this conference.
Thanks so much for raising that, Liz. Extremely important fight that's going on right now, and I should say $15 an hour is not a living wage here, not close to it, especially for a person who's trying to support a child. So it should be adjusted. I know it's tricky to be working that out, and it would be an incredible advantage over what we have now. But I'd like to see this minimum wage campaign be on an incremental scale so that it becomes tied in with what the real cost of living is.
It's true, right, Molly and Elizabeth, that this $15 still does not bring the minimum wage up to where it would have been if it had kept up with inflation like 30 years ago. Is that correct? Yeah, so we're still behind even with that.
Yes.
Hi, my name's James Bowman. I'm the co-founder and planning and policy principal at Boston Food and Farm. We're a social enterprise consulting firm working on community food systems planning and urban agriculture project development. But I wanted to actually start by thanking both of you for your passionate and thoughtful talk. Particularly Molly, I wanted to thank you for setting the context of your talk with the slide on institutional racism as an important context for food justice, for a food justice discussion. My real question, though, is, Frankie, you said that you have a strong trust for market economies, and I mean, I'm a social entrepreneur, so I understand the power of the private market, but at the same time, when we have corporations that are law-bound to create profit in this country without taking into account social and environmental costs, I'd really like to hear what your perspectives are on the new institutions, both public, private, and potentially hybrid, that we need to be bringing around food sovereignty and food justice.
Well, I don't know what I said to lead you to think that I was such a fan of, certainly not the market that we have today, which I call this one rule market, that is highest return to existing wealth. That by definition will create hunger and dire poverty. So what I think that could happen in a living democracy, and what has happened in places that have more genuine democratic accountability, that they create rules around their the market exchange, including a real, what would happen if we really had an EPA that really tested pesticides, for example, and really kept out those that are dangerous. I mean, it really doesn't take a PhD in political science, I don't think, to understand that yes, market exchange is a handy tool. We don't want to have everything centrally distributed. And yes, we have to put boundaries around it. So what is fair, what is unfair, what is and we have to have the commons returned. For example, there was a beautiful article about the cost of coal and the fact that coal producers don't pay any of the social, environmental, human costs. and they are using the commons and yet not returning, not paying a fair price for that. And the work of Peter Barnes, for example, and Who Owns the Sky, the idea that here all this pollution happens and yet it's free to pollute the sky, that is a commons for all of us. I mean, these are conceptual tools and there are regulatory tools that we can use to make the market work to serve life, our life and other species. So that's all I meant in terms of the market. I don't think anybody today is advocating complete state control. And so it's a question of how do we get a democratic accountability in our governance so that we can set those rules that work and can be enforced. That is the key, right?
Good afternoon. My name is Amy Laura Kahn. I'm an attorney in Philadelphia working on land security and land sovereignty issues with community gardeners and market farmers. And I really thank you so much for framing this conversation around human rights. I wanted to come back to the question of justiciability within North America, of social, economic, and cultural rights, because we obviously are not familiar with how to do that, but point folks to the US Human Rights Network and the work that's happening across issue. I think more work around the right to food needs to happen, but there's a lot of work around immigrants' rights, around environmental justice, et cetera, that's happening across issue and really dealing with intersectionality. And point also folks to the work, for example, of advocates for environmental human rights, bringing a petition on behalf of Mossville, Louisiana residents to the Inter-American Commission for Human Rights, the work on a real local level to kind of establish local human rights. We can do this if we continue to push the human rights narrative. There are a lot of tools out there, but I think in the food justice context, we haven't gone far enough. So I just want to raise those as kind of markers for folks to further this work.
Thanks. Those are all excellent resources.
Thank you.
I think we have one more question. Kolu.
Thanks. I'm Kolu Zigbee. I'm a current Loeb Fellow. And I was curious if either of you, and then I was thinking, Frankie, that you might refer to Anna's book, Diet for a Hot Planet, to speak about the relationship between the food system, food justice, racial equity, and climate change. Given the role of industrial agriculture, and agribusiness in creating a hot planet.
Thank you, Kola. The book is Diet for a Hot Planet by Anna Lappe, and also in the work that I'm finishing called World Hunger 10 Myths, we have a key chapter on climate change, that climate change does not have to mean more hunger. So that nexus that Kolu refers to is so, it's so real that the people, as you all know, I'm sure, those who are already the most impacted by climate change, and I particularly get an image of Bangladesh and thousands of people moving into Dhaka every year now, or of some enormous number every day because of the rising waters. So on the one hand, that people of color throughout the world are already seriously impacted by climate change, and that reality is not part of the consciousness of most of us in the global north. And at the very same time, what Anna points out and what we were so excited to share in our new book is that really small, poor farmers in the global south are our climate heroes if we would just get behind them, because it precisely is their work in developing agroecological practices that emit many fewer greenhouse gases and potentially can greatly increase the sequestration of carbon. That could be, if we really got behind them, they are seriously a big part of the solution. And so it's just this tragic combination of they are now suffering the most, and yet their advance could advance us all. I think particularly of Niger, the country of Niger, if you follow this at all, but among the poorest in the human development index to one of the most devastated countries in the world, and yet Niger, through agroforestry, the integration of crops and trees, has reclaimed about 200 million acres. I'm sorry, 200 has nurtured the growth of 200 million new trees on 12.5 million acres, and has addressed food insecurity by doing that for about 2.5 million people. And we found that people are coming back to villages who had left because they can now feed their families. And with all these trees, of course, that's addressing climate change. So that they're trying to take that now into 15 countries in the flank of the Sahara Desert called the Sahel part of the world. And so what Anna and I try to do is really the both and here, both sounding the alarm of this needless suffering that is on the people least responsible for the heating of our planet, and more than that, encouraging their development of agroecological practices for the benefit of them and all of us, because of course these practices not only help in climate change, but they produce more food, and they make themselves more resilient against drought. So it's one of these amazing win-win-wins, but very few of us really appreciate it, and that's what Anna is so good at getting across, and we hope that our new book can help too. But thank you for that great question, Kolu.
Thank you both so much for a wonderful talk. We're now going to go on to our last session of the day.